Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Hello.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
March 6, 1984. Britain's National Coal Board announces the closure of 20 collieries, which means the loss of 20,000 jobs. Within days, half of Britain's 187,000 miners are off the job. Within 2 weeks, 80% of the men have downed tools. It was to be one of the most bitter and expensive industrial disputes in British history.
It just hadn't occurred to anyone that there was any way we could lose. We were the miners. We were the National Union of Mineworkers. You couldn't defeat us. Everybody knew you couldn't defeat us. You know, I think we thought we were invincible.
Although neither side could have envisioned it at the time, the strike would last almost a full year. A year of violence, media distortion, and subterfuge courtesy of MI5, Britain's spy agency. Long before the strike began, the battle lines were drawn. Capitalism, epitomized by Thatcherite economic policy, versus socialism, as represented by the trade union movement. The Iron Lady was still riding the wave of victory from the Falklands War when she cautioned Britain on a new war, a new adversary, what she referred to as the enemy within.
Now, I think that she was deliberately misrepresented. She was talking about the politically motivated militant trade union leaders who were trying to usurp the role of the democratically elected government. That was what she meant by the enemy within.
The National Union of Mineworkers was Britain's most powerful trade union. If Thatcher was referring to the leadership of the union as the enemy within, that would include its president, Arthur Scargill.
I wanted at all times to get rid of a conservative government by legitimate means. But above all, what I intended was that the British mining industry should survive and it should be developed and expanded.
Thatcher's agenda was also clear. She wanted to privatize industry, sell off state-owned corporations to the highest bidder. At the top of her hit list was the coal industry. Coal had always been an integral part of British life. Not only was it used to heat millions of homes, but it was the primary fuel for industry. When the strike was called, 80% of the country's electricity was still generated by coal.
The problem with coal was that the industry was hopelessly uneconomic. It was eating up taxpayers' money at a more rapid rate than all the other nationalised industries put together. And if you're trying to get the public finances right, if you're trying to reduce the budget deficit, if you're trying to create in the longer run the possibility for responsibly cutting taxes, and it was costing far more to extract each ton of coal than the ton of coal was worth. So this was crazy.
Well, it was a civil war launched by Mrs. Thatcher. There's no other way of describing it. But her strategy was to destroy the trade union movement, to set up the most, in the guise of lifting the state off your back, which is the sort of normal right-wing argument, she was actually imposing a sort of police state.
Scargill's concern for the future of his members was based on inside information he'd received about the Coal Board's plans to destroy the coal mining industry. Despite this, and the fact that there was widespread support for the strike, many miners chose to continue working. In Nottinghamshire, 75% stayed on the job. In an attempt to persuade all miners to join the strike, flying pickets were deployed. This was a strategy whereby hundreds and later thousands of strikers would move in to picket a specific location.
And with 80% of miners out on strike, I'll tell you what you say, and I'll tell you what you do. You tell members of your union, obey the 11th commandment, thou shalt not cross a picket line.
For any union member in any industry who chooses to ignore the call for solidarity by crossing a picket line, there is only one word.
If there were a scabbing, I wouldn't piss on him if he were on fire. The people, they've got no morals. They've got nothing.
The scab who led the Nottinghamshire miners, I don't refuse to say his name, but apparently his own father wouldn't speak to him, which sounds like a good man to me. And he never spoke to him to the day he died. Such a shame.
It was inconceivable to me at the time that people could defy a call for strike action when people were on strike. Inconceivable to me that I would ever cross a picket line. I'd rather be found dead on the other side of the picket line than crossing a picket line.
I mean, hate is a big word. At the time we did hate, and we were learnt, as we've previously said, we learnt how to hate in 1984.
As the flying pickets increased, so too did the police ranks. Within 2 weeks of the strike starting, Thatcher drafted in an additional 8,000 police officers. A classic case of the state versus the people.
That's my identity card. That's what we're all gonna have to have.
In anticipation of the strike, Thatcher had ordered coal to be stockpiled. The drop in production was having absolutely no effect on the economy. The miners' strike of '84 had nothing to do with wages or benefits or working conditions. It was about protecting an industry, preserving an unglamorous yet vital way of life steeped in tradition.
Of all the jobs, working in a pit is a foul, dangerous, smelly, rotten, awful place to work. And in a way, you'd wonder, why would you fight for these jobs?
It's something I think that you need to be almost born into. You know, if your father did it before you, as in my case, my father, my grandfather, you didn't mind going into mining. You had no more aspirations and you longed for the day when you left school to follow in your father's footsteps.
In the 19th century, it was coal that fueled Britain's industrial revolution. Back then, it was not uncommon for women and boys and girls as young as 5 to labor in the pits. Coal mining has always been extremely difficult and dangerous. In the 19th century, the average death toll was over 1,000 a year. Not surprisingly, miners were among the first group of workers to organize. By the turn of the century, membership had grown to over 600,000, a quarter of all trade unionists in the country. As a force, the miners were powerful. Just how powerful became evident in 1972. That year, the miners voted to take industrial action over pay demands. To maximize impact, they decided to target power stations, steelworks, ports, and coal depots. A then obscure spokesman for the Yorkshire miners organized the flying pickets. At a coke depot in Birmingham, there was the inevitable clash with the police. It became known as the Battle of Saltley Gates. In the end, the plant was forced to close down. The miners' strategy was to render the country powerless. It worked. To conserve energy, the government was forced to introduce a 3-day working week for the entire country. Within 7 weeks of its starting, the dispute was resolved.
We want assurances from the chairman of the gas board in writing that only permit holders...
For his part, the obscure spokesman was arrested twice. He was Arthur Scargill, and from that point on, he became a household name as he soared through the ranks of the union. The strike also served to underscore, in the minds of both the government and the public, just how important coal was to the country's economy. 18 months later, the miners went on strike again. It was almost a repeat of '72. This time, however, Conservative Prime Minister Ted Heath called for a general election, demanding an answer to the question, who rules Britain? He got his answer loud and clear. The Conservatives were defeated and Labour took power. A deal was reached with the miners and the strike ended just 4 weeks after it began. During the strike of '74, there was one obscure Conservative member who had disagreed with Ted Heath's call for an election. Her name, Margaret Thatcher. The following year, she challenged Heath for the leadership of the Conservative Party and won. 4 years later, the Iron Lady was elected Prime Minister. There are some who say that Mrs. Thatcher learned from the miners' strikes of the '70s and vowed not to let it happen again. And there are some who say she took the '74 defeat personally, and the fight with Scargill 10 years later was born out of pure vengeance.
No, I don't think that was true at all. I mean, when she appointed me Secretary of State for Energy in September 1981, the only briefing she gave me, which she said, Nigel, we mustn't have a coal strike. That was actually the briefing she gave me for the job.
Coming to fruition.
Arthur Scargill has no doubts about the Tory agenda.
It was a deliberate ploy on the part of the Tory government to destroy the National Union of Mineworkers. And the reason's as simple as ABC. They intended to try and pay back the NUM for the defeat we inflicted upon them in 1972 and 1974. And I'm proud of what we did to them.
We didn't want a battle. Let me make it absolutely clear, we didn't want a battle. We wanted to make the coal industry profitable. The trouble was that this meant closing a lot of pits.
Even though the strike has been declared official and more than 80% of miners have downed tools, many of the Nottinghamshire miners continue working. Their argument, supported by Thatcher and the media, is that the union has not called for a ballot for a national strike. One of the reasons is the fact that the Notts miners had completely ignored a national ballot 7 years earlier. In 1977, the Coal Board tried to introduce an incentive scheme. Based on output, the scheme would favor miners in the more lucrative coal fields, among them Nottinghamshire. The right wing of the union called for acceptance of the new initiative. Opposing the motion, Scargill and the left wing argued that the scheme would be divisive, putting miner against miner, pit against pit, and area against area. The motion went to a national ballot and was soundly defeated.
What happened? The Notts miners, those super Democrats who wanted a ballot, ignored the ballot decision and signed an incentive agreement. So much for your ballot, so much for democracy. If they could ignore it in 1977, I'll tell you this, they'd have done the same bloody thing in 1984 that they'd done it in 1970.
In March, 23-year-old David Jones is killed during clashes while on picket duty. The tragedy underscores the lengths to which the Notts miners are willing to go to continue working.
And Arthur Scargill turned up and called for calm, called for us to cool it, and called for a minute's silence for David Jones. And the cops withdrew, took their helmets off for a minute's silence, pickets withdrew, and in that minute's silence, the scabs ran down the road and went to work. And we said to them, "You're never going to work when there's a dead bloke at the top of your pit lane." And they shouted back, "A bit of hard cheddar, that kid. A bit of hard cheddar." Now, if you're prepared to step over a body to go to work, if you're prepared to allow 20,000 armed psychopaths to take you to work in an armoured bus, that tells me that a little piece of ballot paper ain't going to make a big difference to you.
By the end of May, less than 3 months after it began, police have arrested more than 2,500 people. Over the summer, the situation would deteriorate even further. June 1984, the British miners' strike is into its 12th week. Striking miner Joe Green is hit by a truck and killed while on picket duty at a power station. The idea of picketing power stations is a return to the strategy of 1972. Scargill hopes for a repeat of his success at Saltley Gate. This time, the target is British Steel's plant at Orgreave. The plant produces coke, a byproduct of coal, then transports it to a steelworks nearby. According to Scargill, British Steel has signed an agreement with the NUM not to move any coke during the strike. The agreement is obviously being ignored. Throughout May and June, thousands of pickets converge on Orgreave.
Well, keep moving. No. You keep moving. No. You keep moving. Keep moving. No. No. I said move.
On one occasion, Scargill himself is arrested and charged with obstruction.
Come on, go. No way. Listen, go.
No way.
Listen.
No way.
You're blocking the footpath. Right, arrest him, then he's under arrest.
The events of June 18th would become known as the Battle of Orgreave. As they gathered that morning, the miners realized that something was not quite right.
It was funny because when we were going into Orgreave, the police were Instead of stopping us, they were, you can park down there, lads, you know what I mean? And it were like that. We were thinking, obviously, it's a set-up, which it was. It was a set-up, all right.
They wanted the miners in that Orgreave field. They wanted to try their tactics, and they wanted to show the miners who were boss, and that load of coal was going to get to the steelworks at Scunthorpe. Orgreave was orchestrated.
Orgreave was really the turning point. Looking back now, it was a set-piece incident, really, where on one hand the forces of law and order could actually make a statement that these trucks could get through. On the other hand, there's no doubt that the miners' union saw it as a place that they could win.
Line up here, line up, bloody hell, line up, inspectors!
We were pushing forward and they were putting... It just happened. We were trying to get in to stop the wagons coming out and it just happened. It just happened. Next minute there were battens coming over Shields and lads started having to go back, and then it was next minute they just opened ranks and the fucking horses were through.
According to the police, the cavalry was deployed in response to a barrage of stones and missiles.
Well, yes, we went in first because, you know, it was a measured response to a very, very violent situation. Missiles being thrown, kicking, lashing out, using weapons.
Oh, that was rubbish. That was rubbish. I mean, there weren't any stones in that field, actually. When the major fighting took place, it's a grassy field. There were no stones there. People responded to the cavalry by throwing clods of earth, actually.
There were points when, yeah, I'd be less than honest if I didn't think that it was a civil war. You know, hey, what's going on here? This is just not really what it's about. You know, what are we doing getting into this situation?
In all, there are 93 arrests and 709 injured.
I must tell you that what we've got is an attempt to substitute the rule of the mob for the rule of law, and it must not succeed.
There's no doubt the conflict between striker and scab arouses passions and divides communities. There are incidents of violence and intimidation on both sides. But there are also cases of extreme provocation by the police.
You know, the police would throw money into the miners' bucket, say, keep the strike going because the overtime is paying my mortgage. I mean, the provocation was on an incredible scale, and many of the police were very, very uneasy about the role they played.
In fact, most displays of ignorance on the part of the police are attributed to officers deployed from outside the coal mining communities.
The majority of the miners, you know, were, you know, law-abiding, decent people. The majority of police officers were officers that were merely doing the duty. Yes, there was an element on both sides that didn't quite come up to standard. Among my colleagues, there was a minority that did do acts that weren't acceptable. On the other hand, there were some gross criminal conduct committed by the thug element of the mining community that was equally, totally unacceptable.
All the evidence shows that actually it was the police that initiated the violence, the police that dealt it out against people who were not using violence themselves. So as times passed, the evidence which, of course, mining communities knew at the time and trade unionists knew at the time, namely that the violence was often, if not usually, provoked by the police, wasn't clear at the time to many people in Britain.
Throughout the strike, settlement negotiations are ongoing between the NUM and the Coal Board. At one point in July, an agreement is reached. All the pits will remain open. It is, in effect, a total victory for the miners. Before the agreement is ratified, the Coal Board demands the insertion of the word beneficial into the document. Beneficial is code for closure on economic grounds, the reason behind the strike in the first place. Not surprisingly, the deal is off the table. By summer's end, the miners have been off the job for 6 months. The loss of income is taking a heavy toll on the strikers and their families. Throughout the coal miners' strike, Scargill calls on the support of fellow trade unionists and at the same time warns of the consequences of standing idly by.
We've got an Orwellian nightmare poised to take over. They've come for the miners. And I warn all trade unionists, if they don't support the miners, when it comes to your turn, there'll be nobody left to defend you because the police paramilitary operation will have succeeded.
The response is sporadic. While the dockers and train workers do strike in sympathy with the miners, their actions are short-lived.
Now, we stand shoulder to shoulder with them.
Even though the Trades Union Congress backs the miners in theory, little is done by way of practical support. November 1984, 8 months into the strike. Taxi driver David Wilkie drives a miner to work in South Wales. 2 striking miners drop a concrete block from a bridge onto his car. Wilkie dies instantly.
People, rightly or wrongly and for their sins, believed it was the scab who should have got killed and not the driver. Although it hadn't been the intention of the miners to actually kill anybody. They intended to stop them going to work. They intended, if possible, to derail the car. But anybody set off to actually kill anybody.
All sides in the dispute condemn the attack.
The National Union of Mineworkers disassociates itself from any acts of this kind which occur anywhere away from the six mines.
Well, I don't suppose you can justify killing innocent people, but you can, to some extent, understand the anger of the people who go out and do them sorts of things. Maybe not in the cold light today you can't, but you've got to imagine the atmosphere, what it were like then. It was almost a warlike situation. You'd got 2 sides, and you had to get the better of them. They had the government, the media, the newspapers particularly, everybody on their side. They had the taxpayers' money to throw at the dispute. We had nothing, rags that we stood up in.
Thatcher is prepared to spend like a drunken sailor. With an average of 3,000 additional police officers deployed for each day of the strike, plus overtime payments, the police bill alone is escalating into the millions.
Certainly, it was expensive for the government during that year. My own recollection, it was something like 2.5 billion of public money had to be spent. And of course it was worth it.
The presence of additional police is clearly evident for all to see, yet the operations of Special Branch and Britain's intelligence service MI5 are less obvious.
Thatcher gave the go-ahead to all parts of the state, but including the intelligence services, to operate full-on against the NUM and against the strike. I think it reveals the extent to which the establishment in Britain were prepared to use any and all tactics to try and counter the influence of the left in what was a very powerful trade union movement.
In addition to the usual telephone monitoring and bugging of offices, it has since been revealed that there was a highly placed agent on the executive committee of the union. Codenamed Silver Fox, this person was reporting back to Special Branch officers. The information gleaned provided advance notice as to time and location of pickets.
Large numbers will be congregating to a colliery somewhere in the northeast part.
The police were able to outmaneuver the strikers. Scargill is not surprised.
I would be amazed if there wasn't. There were agents planted within the NUM, both for a number of years prior to 1984, in readiness, almost like sleepers. I believe that all our offices were constantly bugged.
I think that it was perfectly understandable that the government and the agencies of the government should be well informed about what was going on. You know, people do try and inform themselves. It is what happens. I mean, it is not normally made public. The problem was that the president of the National Union of Mineworkers, who was a Marxist, entirely politically motivated, and he wanted to create a battle in order to bring down the government. That may sound far-fetched, but that was his plan.
It is absolutely true that I wanted to do everything in my power to legitimately bring about a change of government. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and it's because of my views, because of my passion, that they regard me as an enemy of the state. I'm an enemy of capitalism. I'm a supporter of socialism, and it's for that reason that it doesn't surprise me that the state and its security services have always targeted me and regarded me as a subversive.
In October, it looks as if the miners are again close to victory. NACODS, the trade union representing pit deputies, votes to join the miners. The deputies are responsible for underground safety, and by law, no work can be carried out unless there is an inspector present.
They would have stopped every pit in Britain. There would have been no more coal turned out in Britain, and we would have won. For reasons which nobody's ever come up with, they decided not to implement the ballot decision of their own members. They were bought off in one way, shape or another. I know the leaders have always said they weren't, but I have no other explanation as to why they backed off.
While the Coal Board has the government, the police and most of the media on their side, the miners also have support. Women against pit closures.
I think people started to realise very early on we had to close ranks, we had to defend ourselves. For some people, I think it was a case of showing the rest of the world or showing the government that families were behind this strike. It was a solidarity to show that, you know, that as communities they could be together and that we could help one another.
Nothing got paid, simple as that. I mean, but at the end of the day, we were all in the same boat. Electric bills never got paid, mortgages never got paid. We'd all get together and help each other. I mean, nobody had any money. We used to get £1 a day picketing money, and it used to get us a packet of fags. That's what I could never understand with anybody saying, I had to go back to work because I didn't have this and I didn't have that. None of us had it. None of us had anything. We ain't got 2 Mr. Scratch's arse we, but we got by. We all got by.
I mean, people lost their homes. People had no money to buy food, and that's where the solidarity came in there, because we started kitchens going. We started going out and collecting food and making sure people had a meal. There were things like people getting fuel.
The major problem I had was I never had a fire. We managed to get together enough stuff. I'm going to have to say this very quick because I get very emotional over this. We managed to get together enough fuel to light the fire for a couple of hours. I can never say that. I can never ever get that out. It was difficult. Yeah. The main difficulty for me was the lack of fuel. You know, because I had a daughter at the time. Still got the daughter, of course, but she was much younger then. So that was the hard part of it.
We'd do simple things sometimes, maybe go to other areas and collect food, maybe go outside a supermarket, explain to people as they're going in and out why we were there. I even had people come knocking on my door, people I didn't know, and people from miles away, find out where I lived, and come knocking on the door with boxes and boxes of groceries and different provisions to take down to share out, just out of the blue.
No more beans, he said. No more beans. We can't stand beans.
Support for the striking miners is overwhelming. Food, money and toys for Christmas come in from all over the world. The National Coal Board also comes bearing gifts.
If you returned before Christmas, they would give you an advance payment of £1,000, which to some people who sold every scrap of furniture in their house, they were sat on orange boxes, you know. It was a mighty temptation. And that's when quite a few went back towards the Christmas period. And that's when we knew that really the writing were on the wall.
January 1985, 10 months into the strike. Margaret Thatcher claims that more than a third of the 187,000 miners are back working, and the rest are returning at a rate of $2,500 a week.
The government inflated the numbers and the media just bought it. They didn't really have an independent way of assessing the return to work figures. And it was very important for the government to create a momentum of a sense of miners going back on a big scale. Because obviously a strike is about collective action. If people see that some people are breaking the strike, it can help to undermine their morale, obviously. So it was an important part of the psychological warfare on the strikers to create the sense that more people were going back to work than really were.
As all prospects for victory fade, the miners strive for one final consolation: that sacked miners be reinstated. The Coal Board adamantly refuses. March 3rd, 1985, almost a year to the day since the strike began. The executive of the union decides by a narrow majority to return to work. Arthur Scargill is against the decision.
We have decided to go back for a whole range of reasons. One of the reasons is that the trade union movement of Britain, with a few notable exceptions, have left this union isolated. They have not carried through TUC Congress policy decisions, to their eternal shame. Another reason is that we face not an employer, but a government, aided and abetted by the judiciary, the police, and you people in the media. And at the end of this time, our people are suffering tremendous hardship.
if all the other so-called unions had come out with us, the Nottinghamshire miners and all this, if they'd have come out with us and we'd have spat, we'd have all spat at the same time, we'd have drowned Margaret Thatcher and the government. But that wasn't to be. We were isolated.
I learnt about the government and the media manipulation. I learned not to read, not to believe what you read in newspapers. But we had a newspaper over here in the miners' strike called Miners, Scum of the Earth. We're not scum of the earth. We were ordinary people who wanted to safeguard our communities and our jobs.
Oh, I felt like it was the most wrong thing I've ever done in my life. The day the strike ended, it was like a bereavement. And going back, I felt like a scab. I felt like, you know, I mean, I've been a vegetarian all my life. I felt like I was eating meat. You know? I felt like I was doing something totally morally wrong.
Yes, it was worth it. What's happened as a consequence was going to happen anyway. So we needed to at least try and stop it. It would have happened. And if we'd not done anything about it, basically what we would have done is just put our hands up and surrendered. And said, do what you're going to do.
It was like a breath of fresh air. It was sad that people had to, that the miners of all people had to eat humble pie, but that was Scargill's fault for pushing them into this battle, which they should never have been involved in. But it was a breath of fresh air.
The outcome of the strike meant that Britain became a less fair place, a place where you know, the market was more rampant than it would have otherwise been, where social protection was less than it would have otherwise been. And from the point of view of progressive-minded people in Britain, I think to this day people see it as an outcome which damaged the country.
When you look back on it now, and you realise we're having wars over energy, to try to close the pits, as Thatcher later did, was one of the greatest acts of lunacy in British economic history. We have 1,000 years of coal under our territory today, and we've closed the pits, and we've no miners.
That's right. The chain, the historic, hereditary chain has been broken, which is as important as anything. The situation where the school leaver followed his father into mines and his grandfather before him, and that were your expectation, that were your aspirations, to follow your father into the mines. That's been broken now, and I really can't see how they're going to ever get that back, because a new generation of school leavers, the parents won't want them to go down the mines, they won't want them to go down the mines. So you've probably lost that skill and feeling that you once had.